Well, thank you. Yeah, it's this is the header if you haven't already seen it. This is a massive subject, so I'm not quite sure how long I've got, but I'll try and get to it as quickly as I can. It's not going to be a, it's not going to be a kind of catch-all, bit of advice on every eventuality, because of course when you're designing for the unknown, you just don't know what you're going to get. But all it is my sort of personal view based on some experience of doing international comps where I've had to rustle together an unknown, and also designing free sequences, it's sort of my personal view. So I'm sure there will be a lot of other views on how best to do this, and then maybe loads of things that I've missed out, but I've tried to sort of include everything that I think goes through my head when I'm designing a sequence. So I'm just going to talk, and then I don't know if there's time, if anyone wants to ask any questions, particularly at the end. Maybe that would be a better time to do it. So I'll just bang on for the next however long. So I'm going to cover the following things. Firstly, why I think it's important to be able to design sequences. And we're going to talk about various elements of sequence design: positioning, choosing the base figures, energy management, being able to see the box as much as possible, fighting the wind, and then physical considerations, human factors. And then something that I think is really important is trying to create some kind of a performance and how you can design that into your sequence, and then actually testing it to see if it works, so flying it, and how I think I sort of try and go about doing that. And then a kind of almost like another subject in its own right, which is unknowns, and I'll talk a little bit about considerations for unknowns at the end. A lot of what I'm going to talk about relates both to designing a free known and designing unknowns, because ultimately you get given a certain amount of figures and you have to try and link them all together. Free knowns, you get a bit more freedom to, obviously you've got 5 additional figures that you can put in, so that's when you can really start to be creative and put things in that are going to sort of highlight your strengths. So I think sequence design in this country is not something that gets talked about a hell of a lot. Whenever I've done training camps, no part of that training camp has really been dedicated to teaching sequence design. So when I started flying in 2007, flying at beginners and standard, there wasn't, you just got given an unknown, or you got given a known and an unknown, and you just went and flew them. You didn't really think that much about them. And when I got to intermediate and started designing a free sequence, and then latterly advanced, when we used to have a free sequence, I never really got that much guidance other than other pilots who were sort of kind of trying to do their own thing. So it's sort of a bit of an overlooked subject, I suppose. And I think actually, it's a real key element to success. We can spend a lot of money on AVGAS and coaching, but very few people seemingly take the time to sit down and design a sequence. People often sort of go, would you mind if I flew your free, or just pick a sequence at a contest without really thinking about designing their own. So I think it's a bit overlooked, and it's really important. And the reasons that it is important is because it allows you to manage your entire flight. So you're choosing figures that suit your aircraft, your abilities, possibly the conditions if you've got kind of sight of that. But also, you know, what we're all trying to do is maximize our score. And, you know, although this is a downgrading system, there are ways to make sure that you do maximize your score rather than just minimize your downgrades. And I'll kind of come on to what I mean about that in a bit. So the first key element, well, for me, of any flight is positioning. And you know, the positioning gets scored. So, you know, that is worth, advanced, certainly it's worth 40k. I think at intermediate it's worth 30k. So it's quite a big, you know, score. So that's like a big figure. So that is important, you know, to get a good score for positioning, but also positioning is important for all of the figures. Putting them in the right place is absolutely critical. So if you've got the opportunity to design your own sequence, you should design the positioning from the outset so that you make the sequence easy to position rather than just string a load of figures together and then figure out how the hell you're going to kind of, you know, position it in different conditions. You also want to make life as easy as possible for the judges so that they can see what you're doing. So you don't want to be too far away, you don't want to be too close, you don't want to be too far to the left or right. You want to put it right in front of them. Because the reality is if you're at the back of the box, they actually can't see what you're doing. If you've ever watched anyone fly and they're at the back of the box, it's almost impossible to judge. But you can design a sequence that allows you to keep it in the right place, which is in the front half of the box. And you also want to optimize your presentation. So you want balance, and you want, you know, you want each figure to be in the right place, because depending on what the figure, the judge's perspective is really important, how they see that figure. So if it's a loop, for example, that doesn't want to be right over their heads because they wouldn't be able to see the shape. You know, if it's a stall turn, they want to be seeing it from an angle that they can see whether or not it's bridged. And if they can't see those things very well, the scores start sort of plummeting just because they're not really going to give you the benefit of the doubt, in my opinion. And the other important thing is to keep it compact. So keep the sequence in front of the judges at all times. This whole thing about use all of the box, I don't really agree with that. I think you want to keep it, you know, 1,000 meters is not very big, but if you're near the front of the box, it's a long way off to the left or right if you're at either end. So you want to kind of keep as much of it in the middle as possible. And you can design that into the sequence before you've even taken off, so you're not having to fight whilst you're flying. So this is an example of what not to do, which is my free sequence from 2011 when I flew at the European Advanced Championships in Slovakia. And I didn't really have a clue what the hell I was doing. And I look at this now and I just think, I don't know what I was thinking. But it relies heavily, this sequence, on there being a fairly stiff breeze straight down the A-axis. Of course, when we got out to Slovakia, I think there probably wasn't. So I was really fighting it all the way, and I just sort of, you know, had no clue how to design a sequence, and really even after flying it, not really knowing what was wrong with it. But when we started looking at the other competitors' sequences, and certainly the guys that were doing really, really well, we realized that they looked like they were drawing in a different, language. Basically, it looked completely different from what I was flying, and much more compact. Every figure was a turnaround figure. There was some really sort of nice, flexible kind of crossbox figures, and it was just totally inspiring. And when we came home, we sat down and we wrote down all the things that we'd learned. And one of the key things was sequence design and how we needed to get better at it. And not just designing our own free sequences, but designing unknowns as well. Because whilst we were out there, we had 2 unknown sequences to design, and frankly, they were a total disaster because we decided to fly our own sequences rather than pick a sequence that somebody who knew better than us had designed. So this, in contrast, was the free sequence I flew in at the next international comp I did, which was in 2015 in Romania. And you can see how completely different that looks, even on paper. Before you've even flown it, it's going to position well in the box, because it doesn't really sort of go anywhere. It just goes up and down and back and forth. There's no going along from side to side like a typewriter. So the key element, I guess, the first bit is, once you've got your 5 figures, and this is in a free name, you need to then choose 5 more figures that are going to play to your strengths. But I think, for me, there's some definite kind of ground rules that I try to work to, and based just on my experience, which is looping figures are very easy to downgrade and quite difficult to fly as well, because it's all about the shape, and you can't see the shape that you're flying. So it's a very easy figure to make mistakes on and very easy to downgrade. So I try to minimize any looping figures. Similarly, I try to minimize 45s as much as possible, although they can come in quite handy because you can put quite a lot of additional elements on them. But I've had too many judging sheets where the same figure have had steep and shallow for the same 45 line. 45s are quite difficult to judge. They are also quite prone to going shallow or steep if you're not concentrating on what you're doing. So that I try to minimize those as much as possible, make life easy for myself. And in turn, I try to maximize vertical lines, because they use up less box, basically. So I'm trying to keep it in, if I'm trying to keep it in front of the judges, I don't want to be dashing back and forth across in front of them all the time. I want to be sort of keeping it as much towards the center of the box as possible, and verticals help you to do that. And the other thing, which I'm going to demonstrate hopefully in a minute, is that K factor is not necessarily a good indicator of whether or not you're going to get a good score on a figure. And the reason for that, I think, is something to do with load shedding, which is a concept that Alan talks about in his book, which I'm sure many of you, if not all of you, have read. There's a whole few pages about load shedding, and that's judges not being able to necessarily perceive all of the elements or the errors that are in front of them, because there's just so much to look at and so much to try to take on board. So they tend to discard certain elements and focus on the things that are really going to be easy to downgrade. So for example, if you had a flick on a vertical down line, they might pay a lot less attention to the line lengths before and after the flick, because they want to see if the flick is good or not. That's not necessarily always true, but that's just one example. So this is my free known from 2016. I think this is when I was in the World Aerobatic Championship, World Advanced Aerobatic Championships in Radom. And what's really interesting, and I found this with a lot of sequences I flew, is that the high K figures tended to score quite well. And the lower K figures, which you can see here, this figure 4, is one of the lower scores, but yet it's a fairly straightforward figure. There's not much to it really. You know, it's a pull up 2 of 8 P loop. You'd have thought that given that I could get a 7.8 on figure 2, which has got quite a lot going on, I'd be able to score better than 7.25 on a simple P loop. But I think you could attribute some of that to load shedding by the judges. So there's so many elements to judge on figure 2 that they discard some of the downgrades. So for example, on the down line, the 1/4, 3/4, because that takes up quite a lot of the line, and they've got someone in their ear going opposite, you know, 1/4, opposite 3/4. There's hell of a lot going on. Unless they see any gross errors, you know, they may not spot some of the other errors that they might spot on figure 4. I'm sure some people would disagree massively with that, but this is just one example, and I've got lots of score sheets which say the same thing. So minimizing or trying to balance the K across a free known, across the figures in a free known, is not necessarily the recipe for success that people might think it is. Sometimes better to have a high K figure that you know you can just nail than spread it out across a lot of medium K figures that might be subject to downgrades. Does that all make sense? So here's an example, right? So this is just kind of like, this is based on some scores that I've received over a given year. Okay, so a loop with a 404 in the top. It's only worth 21k, but I got 6.5 on that, probably because the radius of the loop was uneven, the 4-point roll wasn't centered, I might have been over and under on a couple of the 4, but it takes a long time to fly that figure, and it's all very slow, and it's very, very easy for the judges to sit there and take marks off. Whereas this figure, the figure 3, the stall turn, it's already a high K base figure, and it's 24k versus the loop's 10. So unless you make any huge cock-ups, it's not that hard to fly. You've already got, you know, 24k in the bag before you've done any rolls. You know, a 1.5 roll on the down line, you can see where you're going. You're probably going to stop it accurately. Very easy to score points. So, you know, when I'm looking at what I'm going to inject into my free known, I would be more inclined to put a figure in like this, even though it's high K, than a lower K figure that might seem simple, but is very easy to observe any errors. So here's another example. You know, this figure is 33k, but very easy to for the judge to put his finger up and start marking the line lengths on that. And if you know, that is hard to balance the lines in a figure like this. Half up and a flick on the way down, it is quite difficult to balance. very easy for them to take marks off. Whereas a much more complex figure, which is 43k, there's so much going on this down line, but by the time you've done all this stuff in the middle, the judges have forgotten what the beginning line length was, and quite frankly, they're too busy making sure that you're rolling the right way, that your flick's accurate. So assuming everything being equal and assuming you can fly that figure as well as you can fly that figure, sometimes it's better to go for the slightly more complex option. So choosing base figures is really important. And I'll kind of come on to this later, but I think it's really important to fly stuff that you really enjoy flying, and that you're good at, but that it's fun to fly, because you've got to practice this sequence for months on end, possibly, if you're lucky. So you need to enjoy every time you fly it. You want to have fun doing it. So I think the more you enjoy the figures that you fly, the better you'll fly them, and the less likely you are to get frustrated with the whole process. So the next thing, which I think you can design into the sequence, is energy management, which of course is absolutely critical for flying any sequence. And I think it's really important to understand your aircraft and what it's capable of, for starters. So what does that, how much height can you gain in a half loop up, or how little height can you gain in a half loop up, or how little height can you lose in a half loop down? All of this stuff's really important. It's worth having a couple of flights where you do nothing but measure all of these height gains and losses, because when you come to design a sequence, you can have, I've got a little book that I keep notes in, which has got all the height losses and gains for my aircraft, and all the possible height losses. And so I can I know that I can gain 1,000 feet in a half loop up, for example. It's really important to know all that. And I think when you're designing a sequence, you want to try to, it's all about balancing energy. So I think you want to start with a lot of potential energy. So that means either starting high or starting with a lot of speed. I've got a preference, which I'll talk about later, but you want to start with a lot of energy, and you then want to choose figures that either gain or balance energy. So you either gain height or you gain speed, or it's neutral. You want to avoid figures that lose energy. So putting a tail slide in a free known would be just, if it wasn't already there, would not be a good move, in my opinion. But the other important thing is to optimize the transition between figures to maximize energy, and that in a way is a subject in its own right. But what I mean by that is that if you're above max straight and level speed, you want to be going into the next figure as soon as humanly possible, because all you're doing between those two figures is decelerating. Similarly, if you come off the top of a half loop up, let's say, you want to be in a position where you can in most cases, where you can accelerate straight and level, preferably into wind, to gain energy for your next figure. Now, there might be a situation where the next figure is a half loop down again, but nevertheless, you need to have the option. You can always shut the throttle, but you need to have the option to be able to fly straight and level and gain energy again. So and a lot of this comes down to the aircraft that you fly. So you might find that if you had a stall turn with nothing on the way up, a really good figure to put before that is a half loop up, because you don't need a hell of a lot of speed for a stall turn to pull up and do a simple stall turn. And if you put a really fast figure before it, you're just kind of wasting, wasting energy. So it's about thinking about how you can optimize that transition between the figures. And I guess the final thing is, and this all kind of ties into lots of the different points I'm going to make, but energy management, it's all helped if you can create fluidity and balance in the flight and let the aeroplane fly. What you don't want to be doing is flying very, very slowly, dragging yourself through the sky on the prop. You want the aircraft to have momentum all the time. Not only does that look better, but it also enables the airplane to gain speed and energy at every available opportunity. It's a massive subject, energy management. So, but I think what I'm saying is you can design that into your sequence. It's really important to understand that height and loss gain for your aircraft. Right, this is another thing that I think is really important to consider when you're designing a sequence is how often during that sequence are you going to get a really good look at the box? Because if you're like me, you've got a low wing aircraft with a very limited clear vision panel, that all you can see when you look out of well, cap's pretty good actually. In my laser, it was diabolical. All you could see was wing. So the more time I spent upside down or in knife edge, the better in my opportunity. And I don't mean flying around inverted all the time, but having figures that enabled you to come over the top of a figure so you can have a really bloody good look at the box. The more often you can look at the box, the better you can assess your positioning and do something about it if you feel that you're not in the right place. And I think what you want to try to do is design, and this goes for both free knowns and free unknowns. You want to create low stress scenarios where you can assess your positioning. So you might want to use a linking figure in an unknown to do nothing but almost purely just have a really good gander at the box, fly up and down the box. So like a horizontal S is really good for that. It's fairly low stress, takes a long time to fly. You put very little on it. You only need probably 2 half rolls. But you can really see where you are almost all the way through it because you're upside down at 2 key points. And the other thing, of course, is considering which way you're going to turn, either towards or away from the judges, or roll. Are you going to roll in, if you've got a 4-point roll, are you going to roll towards the judges or away from the judges? And how is that going to help you assess where you are in the box? So I would argue that if you've got a nice opportunity to get into knife edge, say you had a quarter roll one way and a 3/4 the other, I would be doing the quarter towards the judges so I could have a really good look at where they are. Similarly, if you're spinning, you want to think about the last quarter of the spin of which way you're going to come out. So if you're at an airfield like Compton Abbas, for example, you really want to make sure that you've got the runway in sight in the last quarter of the spin. If you haven't, there is almost no way that you are going to end up on the heading that you want to end up on. And again, that can all be kind of designed into the sequence. which again leads on to fighting the wind. So like I said in my, when I showed you my old sequence, my old free sequence from 2011, I clearly had no idea how many different types of wind condition I might experience. I think I just thought that because the competition wind is drawn on the diagram, that that was what it was going to be. But of course, the competition wind is just an arrow on a piece of paper. The actual wind is often very different. And there is a rule which I hope somebody can tell me what it is, but there is a certain amount of tailwind that is allowed in a competition before the box has to be changed. So you could end up flying your sequence with a tailwind. And if you've designed it to only be flown in a headwind, you're in deep trouble. So you want to create, well, the first, I guess the first point is don't allow yourself to be a wind dummy. And by that, I mean, I try to avoid situations where I'm flying very slowly. And that might be stall turns. I'm going to call them mini bridges. Vertical lines up, cap off, fly along a bit, vertical line down. I've got issues with figures like that because whilst you're up there hanging in the breeze, you're at the mercy of the wind. You can do very little to fight it without being, you do very little to fight it without being seen. So what I try to do is to create as many scenarios as I can where I know I can counter the wind without anyone noticing. And by that, I mean, keep moving and create figures that allow you to fly diagonally across the box effectively, at a very small angle, of course, that can't be seen from the judging line. At the top of a figure, you're in plan form to the judges. They can see exactly what you're up to. But when they're looking at you from the side on, profile, very hard, or much harder for them to see whether you're flying absolutely down the A-axis or not. And if you design figures like that into your sequence, it will really help you. I remember in Romania, I put a horizontal S in my sequence, and I had got to a position that I didn't want to be in, which is the far side of the center line, and I used that entire S. It was in an unknown. I used that entire S to move back to where I wanted to be by just flying it, all of it off heading, got a reasonably good score for that figure and got good positioning. Nobody noticed, basically. The other thing I think is really important is to have at least one crossbox corrector, but don't rely on it. So, you should be flying, you should be fighting the wind all the time, but sometimes you do end up not quite where you want to be, or you want to move perhaps closer to the judges, or you want to position yourself away from the judges to come back for the end of the sequence or whatever. But it's really useful to have a figure that will take you onto the B-axis for some amount of time. But you need to be able to control how much it takes you across box. So, and just as a kind of what I try to do is to create something that allows you to either move a long way across the box or not move across the box at all. And it usually consists of two separate figures. And you want to come out of the first figure not going particularly fast. I think is the critical a bit of advice, and I'll just nip back to my free sequence. So if you look at figure 6 and 7, which is the P loop and the Humpty, that allows you to do that. As you come out of the P loop, you're not really going that fast, and you can drive that either towards the judges, let's say, for as long as you like, and then pull up and do your Humpty, or you can go straight away after the P loop, and you'll end up in exactly the same place as you were. Fast crossbox coming out of a figure going VNE is not a good scenario to find yourself in, because you are pretty much committed to eating up a lot of crossbox, unless you've got a figure after which can massively counteract it, but it becomes very difficult at that point. And the other thing I try and avoid is being too busy at the bottom of figures or on vertical downlines. That's not always possible to do, but if you end up in a scenario where you've got perhaps a half loop down with a hell of a lot of rolls at the bottom, and then a hell of a lot of rolls going into another half loop up, you've got absolutely no time at the bottom of the box to correct for the wind, look at where you are. It's just a flurry of activity with no real time to think. Sometimes it's unavoidable, but I try to put figures like that at different points of the sequence, so that I can at least have a bit of time before or after to figure out where the hell I am, on what the hell I'm supposed to be doing. Okay, so figure order, right. So there's a lot of different schools of thought on this, I'm sure, and I suspect that a lot of people will disagree with this, but for me, I always say you should start with panache. What I mean is VNE, because not necessarily VNE, but I think I prefer diving into the box. There's various reasons for that. One is I can exactly control my start height and speed, so I can dive in from 3,000 feet and pull out at 1,000 feet and know exactly what speed I'll be doing. And whilst I'm on my way down, I can get a really, really good look at the box. I can look at the judging position, and I can even start fighting the wind at that point by flying slightly off heading. As I dive in and I think, I'm a little bit too close, I can just fly it slightly off heading away from the judges. So for me, always start with a fast start. It means then also that your warm-up figure, which is usually say it's a Humpty or a stall turn, which is, you're going to start fast. You can practice your dive in, and without the wing rocks, and pull up exactly where you want to put figure 1, which in my head would always be would be a fast figure. It might even be a vertical figure. I've seen sequences start with a spin, and I just can't understand how that could be a good idea, because you're not only your wind dummy at that point, but trying to do wing rocks just above the stall is not a good way to start a sequence. The other thing I would say is I think it looks a bit more impressive if you start with a nice, punchy figure where you're making a lot of noise and going quite fast. But that's just me. I think you want to put a crossbox corrector somewhere in the middle of the sequence, preferably upwind, so that as you're flying across box, you don't inadvertently get blown out of the box. And for me, I always try to put the roller at the end. I don't care what anyone says. They're difficult to fly and they never score well. for positioning because they are box. So I try to put those right at the end where they don't impact on the rest of my sequence. And then unknown starts are a little bit more tricky because you don't always have a choice of figures. So it is always a little bit of a compromise. The only what I would say is I would never design a free known with a cross box start. I think I like to start flying along the A axis, but sometimes in an unknown you have to put a cross box first, and the reason for that is because you just run out of cross box correctors. You in a intermediate and advanced free known, if enough people put a figure that starts or finishes cross box, you just haven't got enough. Four linking figures isn't enough. So by putting it at the beginning and or at the end, you can sort of eliminate it effectively. It's not ideal, but sometimes it's the only way. But again, I tend to try to start my unknowns as if I was starting a free known, i.e. fast and with something impressive. The only slight kind of caveat to that is some figures really benefit from not having had a figure before them, i.e. they're good, that you want them to be the first figure. So for example, an octagonal loop is a really good example of that, where you've really got to be on it. You've got to remember the count, but also you've got to start it in exactly the right place. So you want to start it exactly center box, obviously. You want to put it in exactly the right place is what I'm trying to say. If you've just had 6 figures before it, that might start to become a bit more challenging. So getting that kind of like slightly complex, slightly nasty figure out of the way first can actually then help the flow of the rest of the sequence. And there's loads of examples of that type of figure, but an octagonal loop is just one of them. Okay. The other thing you've got to consider when you're sitting in your comfy, cozy sofa in front of the fire during the winter, designing your sequence is what is actually going to happen when you're flying it. And I think that you want to minimize your exposure to G, both positive and negative, but you certainly want to minimize negative G as much as possible, in my opinion. And you also want to minimize negative to positive transitions. For example, a long period of time spent inverted, perhaps in preparation for an inverted spin, followed immediately by a depth charge with a flick at the top where you've got to pull really hard. It's not a good thing to do to yourself, especially if you're going to end up flying, in 40-degree heat in, Eastern Europe somewhere. But even in the UK, it's not a good idea to put your body through that unless there's absolutely no choice. So if you're designing a free known, you want to minimize it as much as possible. Also, you've got to practice it, right? You're going to fly it quite a lot. So you want to feel comfortable flying it. Also, avoid figure confusion. So try and avoid 2 figures that are very, very similar. Even though you can have a, couple of, say, figures that almost look identical that are a different catalog number. I would say try to avoid it as much as possible so that each part of your sequence almost feels like a different chapter of a book. And I said it before, try and fly things that you're going to enjoy flying. Don't fly someone else's free sequence is what I would say, because they've picked figures that they love to fly. They're not necessarily the right figures for you. So fly something that you're really going to enjoy, both practicing and at a competition. There's loads of other human factors, of course, but those are some critical ones. And then the other thing I think is really important is to create a bit of a performance. Make it kind of interesting to watch. So, you know, I always try to start with, you know, whether it's a free known or a free unknown, something that's going to grab the judge's attention. So loud, fast, confident. Like I said, you know, a half loop down or a spin is not a very exciting way to start a sequence, in my opinion, regardless of all of the other things that I talked about, being able to see the box, starting with the maximum amount of energy, etc. And I think it's really important to keep things moving. So if you go and watch an air display, what's really notable about an air display is it's a show. It goes back and forth, it goes up and down. It doesn't just stop sort of for a while in midair, going from one slow figure to another. It keeps moving all the time. So, you know, coming off a 45-degree upline and then attempting to do a, you know, a stall turn immediately afterwards, you're spending too long, not only as a wind dummy, but it's boring to watch. So I think balancing this up, down, you know, exchanging height for speed all the time, not only is it nice to watch, it's good for energy management. And it creates this sense of rhythm to the flight, which I think is another really important thing. And I think it sort of demonstrates to the judges that you know what you're doing. And I know that's not strictly how they judge, and I'll probably be shot down in flames for saying that, but I think you're trying all the time to fill the judges with confidence, to allow themselves to give you a decent score. And in order to do that, you've kind of got to see it above the through the judge's eyes. You know, you've got to visualize it from their perspective, and see it as they see it. So having a little model of an airplane is really, really important, to kind of sit there and kind of, you know, imagine what they're going to see. And you've got plenty of time to design, you know, for free known, you've got plenty of time to design it. Free unknown, you've got virtually no time at all. But when you've got the time, you know, take the time to think about how it's going to look to everyone else. And then you want to go, and once you've designed it, spend hours, possibly weeks, designing your ideal sequence, you want to go and fly it. But I try and avoid just rattling off a free known and then go, oh, I'll just go and fly that and see what that's like. I can't afford to do that. I can't afford to fly something that I'm not absolutely certain is optimized. But also, I think it demonstrates a kind of, if you've really, really thought about it and really considered it and thought about all the things I've talked about up until now, energy management, you know, choosing the right figures, cross box, you should almost know before you even fly it whether it's going to work or not. So the flying it is just to test a few things that perhaps you're not sure about. How much box am I actually going to gain in that, you know, double Humpty? You know, how far is that going to take me? Sometimes it's hard to kind of quantify that until you actually go and fly it, and then you can start making little tweaks. But avoid the temptation to just jump in your aircraft and fly the first thing you design. I think what I do is I treat it like I'm at a competition. I design my sequence and I spend evenings, you know, just walking through it. I go on, you know, perhaps if I go on a walk, I'll just spend the entire time on the walk thinking through the sequence. If I go on a bike ride, I'll spend the whole time just flying through it in my head and thinking, oh, actually that figure into that figure is feeling a bit awkward. So I use that time before I get in the aircraft. So by the time I actually get to fly it, I sort of know how it's going to go. Am I all right for time, Dave?
Yeah, you've got about 5 minutes for the schedule, and then we'll see how many people hang around.
Okay, I'm nearly there. And then really importantly is plan the whole flight meticulously from beginning to end. And, you know, again, you're designing your sequence, you're in charge. This is all about flight management, and the sequence is part of that. So think about what you're going to do, what your warm-up figures are going to be, how you're going to enter the box, plan the whole flight, literally from well, before takeoff to landing. That's what I do. When I get up in the air, I've got no surprises then. I know exactly what I'm doing most of the time, some of the time. And then obviously, you know, it's if you can, it's not always possible, but if you can get someone to watch you fly it, give you some feedback, that's really, really useful. And if you can take video from inside the aircraft or outside the aircraft or from the ground, then that is absolutely, critical as well, if you can do it. Really, really helpful. It's really interesting to watch video of yourself flying. You kind of go, wow, it's not nearly as snappy as I thought it was. And it can really help sharpen your flying up. And then really importantly, fly in a range of wind directions and strengths. So fly it into wind, but then also fly it downwind, fly it backwards, basically. So see how you can position it. If you was in a situation where you had a tailwind, how well would it go? Can you counter a tailwind as well as a headwind, and then fly it cross box to see if you can fly the whole thing, fighting a fairly stiff cross box, which I guarantee you is what you get most of the time in a competition. We know that, you know, the wind is very, very, very rarely straight down the box. It's almost always all on judge or all off judge. And, you know, I've flown sequences where I've flown a sequence in Elvington where there was a 30 or 40 knot off judge wind. And I remember flying at Sywell a few years ago where there was a very, very strong off judge wind. So, you know, you're kidding yourself if you think it's going to be straight into wind the whole time. It's not. So once you've done that, you can then go back and reassess, come back home, reassess it, redesign it, have a think about it, sleep on it before you go and fly it again. So what I would say is, don't just get in and fly it, take the time to really plan it. Same goes for all flying, unknowns, everything, training, everything. You know, just flying the aircraft is not the be all and end all. There's a lot of stuff, as Melanie was saying the other week, a hell of a lot of stuff you can do on the ground. And then finally, in the last 2 minutes, for those of you who, well, which I guess is most of you who are flying intermediate and advanced and unlimited, although I'm sure there's no unlimited pilots sitting here wanting to know my my story. We get four linking figures that enable us to link the 10 proposed figures. And for me, I use all 4 of those figures, you know, as much as possible. And I use them to do a variety of different things. I use them to optimize my speed and position in the box at all times. So transitioning from one proposed figure to another, where I can't find a good natural fit, I'll use a linking figure, but I will use it in such a way that it could help me move position in the box. So what I would say is, there is a school of thought that says use as few linking figures as you can and make them as simple as possible. And I don't personally agree with that. I think the linking figures should be purely there to set yourself up for the big scoring figures. If you've got a, you know, 40k or 30, you know, intermediate, a 30k figure, you really want to nail that and you want to be in exactly the right place. So use the linking figure to do that, even if it means you don't fly the linking figure in the optimal way. And perhaps you might only score a 6 or a 7 on it, but who cares? It's only 6k. I'd rather sacrifice a linking figure and score high on a 40k figure. So I use them to my advantage. I also try to incorporate what I was talking about earlier, which is an opportunity to have a look at the box. We started calling it a tea break. I think Paul Thomson gave me this phrase, a tea break. Might have been Gerald, but it's an opportunity to have a bit of breathing space in the middle of a sequence to go, right, how am I doing? Where am I? What's happening next? What's the wind doing? All of that stuff, and just kind of maybe even just catch your breath if you've just had a lot of pushing and pulling and a lot of frantic stuff going on. And that figure might allow you to have a really good look at the box as well, which we talked about before. So, you know, avoid things that push over the top because you can't see a thing when you're doing that. Always try to be coming round the back of a corner so that you can look down at the box through your canopy. And also using linking figures to counter lots of pushing. So if you've got a figure that pushes out and, you know, or a figure that pushes in, you might want to consider very carefully what linking figure you put before that. And I would suggest if you're just about to push up into a, you know, into a vertical, you know, stall turn with a 3/4 on the way up, that you really don't want to be just having had pushed out of something, because that's a hell of a lot of pushing. So you might find it better to half loop down, roll inverted, something like that. So it's using those figures to sort of counter lots of pushing, and also again using figures to counter the wind, and therefore hopefully maximize your score. And that whole thing about sacrificing linking figures, I think, is really important. I don't think there's any, for me, there's no merit in trying to just put one linking figure in because it's a vertical upline and you think you're going to get 24k or whatever the linking figure k is in intermediate. I'm not sure what it is for the 4 linking figures, but
I think it is 24k.
Yeah, okay, so it's 12 in total. For advanced, it's 24. You know, I would rather split that k across a lot of figures. So that doesn't really cover designing for unknowns, because that is that's a very difficult topic to talk about because we don't know what's going to come up. But all of the stuff I've talked about is it relates to both, really. I think in a free unknown at a competition, even an international competition, you've got very little time. But I think if you can understand all of these concepts that I've talked about tonight and kind of keep those in mind, even if you don't design a free unknown at a competition, it helps you to choose which ones are going to work and which ones aren't going to work. And before you've even got on the aeroplane, you could have lost the sequence, lost that particular sequence just by picking the wrong one. And it's a lesson I learned the hard way, that even if you're not designing a sequence, picking the right sequence is absolutely critical. So I hope that is of some interest to some of you. And that's kind of it.